Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Oilers, in which the Sharks managed to win 6-3, and they conclude now this make-or-break 6-game homestand with a score of 4-2, with the last 4 games being 4 victories. So the Sharks getting close to that 500 mark, only 2 games off from it now. And this was a pretty solid game against the Pacific Division leading, surprisingly, Edmonton Oilers, as they look quite similar early on to that Minnesota Wild game a couple games back. The Sharks come out to an early lead. Brent Burns, Evander Kane's 11th, as well as Marleau to put them up 3-0, and then a Barclay Goodrow early in the second period goal to make it 4-0. And they do sort of fall into the same pitfalls as they did against the Minnesota Wild. They start to allow the Oilers slightly back into the game, and not necessarily the same level of defensive mistakes that are leading to all of these Oilers goals. The Draisaitl one was obviously quite unlucky, going off of Brent Burns' stick in front to make it 4-1, and then it was responded to well by Tomas Hertls. But when you look at the Kassian one, with a very, very bad turnover in the corner to make it 5-2. Meyer made it 6-2 after that, but then just a scramble in front, just an awful shift really for all the players involved on the Sam Gagner one. And it's been a problem here in 3 of the 4 games that the Sharks have played. That Nashville game was so well played, 60 minutes, tight game, but in games where the Sharks seem to come to the lead, they just seem to get quite lazy on the defensive side. And it's not necessarily a surprise that in the last 8 minutes of a third period with a 4-goal lead, the Sharks aren't going to be fully pushing to try and get another goal. But you have to show them that, you have to put up still respectable defensive plays. Because, on this shift that leads to the Gagner goal, we have Brent Burns just wildly swinging at pucks. Gambrell not moving his feet. Gregor just seemed completely lost on the ice. And it was just not a good shift for anyone involved. And, if David Tippett basically hadn't thrown in the towel by not playing McDavid and Draisaitl any shifts in the last 8 minutes, we could have been in for a somewhat tense last 8 minutes like we were against the Minnesota Wild. Now, because he didn't do that, it ended up being quite calm, and the Sharks took a relatively easy last few minutes to the 6-3 victory. But still, if it was against a coach who actually seemed to want to win the game, it could have been a bit more of an issue. So the Sharks do need to clean this up going into the following games. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, as he put up an okay performance in this one. Definitely didn't have much of a chance on the Draisaitl goal. The Kassian one definitely didn't have a chance on after the disastrous turnover in the corner. I would have liked to see a better effort on the Sam Gagner one. This was definitely a scramble in front. You're trying to track the puck, but a lot of players, when they're behind the net, are going to be looking for that bank play. So I would have liked Jones to be able to seal off the post a bit better than that. But still, not too many criticisms to go towards Jones. It wasn't as good as he was against the Nashville Predators, but it was still solid enough to get the victory for the Sharks. Next to talk about would be Barclay Goodrow, and he has a Gordie Howe hat trick in this game with the goal, assist, and a fight when he basically beat up Brandon Manning. And he's been looking quite good on the second line. Now, normally when it comes to a player who's more of a third or fourth liner that's been moved up to the top 6, I normally say it's not necessarily a long-term solution. So, for instance, when it was Lukáš Radil being placed with Meyer and Couture last season, and that lasted a few games because Radil seemed to have the hot hand, I had said that wasn't a long-term solution, and lo and behold, it didn't end up being a long-term solution. Radil was moved back to the fourth line and at times been a healthy scratch. But when it comes to Goodrow here, I do think the situation is actually somewhat different. First of all, the Sharks don't necessarily have a much better option compared to Goodrow to go on that second line. Yes, maybe Sorensen and Marleau, but those players seem to be pretty set to the third line, and so Goodrow seems like the next best option to have there. But also because Goodrow certainly is a different player than Lukáš Radil. Not to say Radil is a lazy player by any means, but he certainly had the, some luck to go with it, right place, right time situation last season. I feel like Goodrow, it's not necessarily right place, right time, but he works very, very hard to be where he needs to be, and he'll get the puck back for players like Meyer, get the puck back for players like Hertl. He's just a workhorse that really gets into the nitty-gritty stuff of the play. He stands up for his teammates and everything like that. And so I'm still not convinced that this is necessarily a long-term solution, and we know that if the Sharks ever start struggling again this season, that DeBoer will not hesitate to do some sort of line blending, and I wouldn't be surprised if Goodrow ends up leaving this second line. But for the moment, it seems to be a pretty good solution because he's looking quite strong with both Meyer and Hertl, who have had these resurgences this season. Hertl started maybe a bit before Goodrow came to the line, but certainly Meyer has looked a lot better in these past few games. Next, I'll talk about the third line for the Sharks. This was a line that I mentioned against the Minnesota Wild as being a very high-risk, high-reward line because they look very, very good in the offensive zone, but after potentially some long shifts, Thornton and Marleau could definitely start to lag behind the play when it comes to the defensive zone, and in this game, they had the very high-reward style of game. They looked very, very good in the offensive zone. I mean, Thornton and Marleau, even in the defensive zone, were making some pretty nice plays. Patrick Marleau led forwards in ice time this game with close to 19 minutes. Joe Thornton was up there with close to 17 minutes, which was quite surprising to see. Normally you don't see these players get that much because not necessarily they're going to do a terrible job with that time, but because you're normally wanting to rest them. But I guess this is the reward for playing well in this game because they did look very, very good. Obviously they had the Patrick Marleau goal. Sorensen had some very nice plays. They led to that first goal from Brent Burns. And so a solid game for the third line. If you take a look at the third line the Sharks had last season, it was Sorensen, Thornton, LeBanc, and that looked very, very good. It was brought into the playoffs and everything like that. And with the lower depth that the Sharks have had this season with the departures that they had in the offseason with Donskoy and Nyquist and Pavelski, it looked like the Sharks would not be able to have that same amount of depth. But if this Sorensen, Thornton, and Marleau line can hold up, it looks like the Sharks can put up a pretty solid three-line attack still. And finally, I will talk about Erik Karlsson, who had himself a pretty solid game, certainly a +3, 3 assists, still a couple of kinks to work out defensively. There was one part pretty early on in the first period where he basically just lets Kara walk right by him to get a shot on net. But still, Karlsson had a few shifts actually against McDavid and Draisaitl, and he made some pretty solid plays, not necessarily defensively as in his own zone, but he made a lot of plays where he was able to intercept passes that would have potentially led to plays for McDavid and Draisaitl. So he definitely did a good job at keeping the offense rolling even when the Oilers had their two best players on the ice. So a pretty solid game for Karlsson, potentially his best of the year, and he's certainly trending in the right direction at the moment. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. They will go visit the Anaheim Ducks as they will head back to the road. They have played the Ducks already this season and have lost. It was not a terrible game early on in the year. I believe it was game 3, but they got stonewalled a bit by John Gibson, and I suspect he will also be in nets for that coming game. The Sharks are 2 games off of 500. If they can get that victory, they'll be 1 game off of 500. So the Sharks, I don't want to speak too soon, but seem to be clawing back into this season and getting themselves back on track. Class dismissed.